I'm Esther, and this is my husband Frank. Welcome to Bible Now. This is Talk 3, which covers readings 10 through 15. That's Genesis 24 through 47.
If you're enjoying these talks and you haven't hit the subscribe button, please do. We appreciate that. In our last talk, we talked about an outline for Genesis. There's 4 events and there's 4 people that you need to remember. In the first talk, we talked about the 4 events. We talked about the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, and also the first person, which was Abram. In this set of readings, we're going to talk about the next 3 people: Abraham's son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, who's also known as Israel, and Jacob's son Joseph. The book of Genesis is part of the Jewish scriptures that they call the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are written by Moses, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And Torah is commonly translated as law. But if you've noticed, when we read last week, there wasn't much laws that really command us. There were more stories to instruct us. But that is also considered Torah. So let these stories that we'll read today instruct us as we grow in wisdom and discernment. A prayer that I like to pray every time that I'll open up the Bible is, Lord, show me wonderful things, great and wonderful things in your word. It's in Psalm 119, verse 18.
Okay, we're getting into reading 10, which starts with chapter 24. Verse 2, I notice a strange phrase, put your hand under my thigh, Abraham says, and make me this promise. This idea is actually seen in cultures both near and far. It's a binding oath. Here it may also have reference to the significance of continuing the family line. But the promises that Abraham asks there are 3 of them. First, please don't let my son marry a Canaanite woman, because the Canaanites have no familiarity with Yahweh. Second request, get my son a wife from the land of my relatives, because they did know Yahweh. And third, but don't take him back there, because Abraham takes so seriously his responsibility to pass the faith on to his son. So he wants to keep his son close. Now, I mention this because we're going to see the issue of marrying foreigners in this set of readings and in other places as we go through the whole Bible. So I want to say from the outset very emphatically, this is not about prejudice. The concern is not racial or ethnic or cultural. The concern is the faith. We want our closest relationships to be with people of like faith.
If we look at verse 7 in chapter 24, we're going to see that God uses an angel to help find Isaac a wife. This is just awesome, and this is an illustration of Hebrews 1:14. Are not all angels ministering spirits sent out to serve those who will inherit salvation?
Yeah, and in that same verse we see the word kindness in my version. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. The Hebrew word there is chesed, which is tough to pronounce and really tough to translate into English. I like the idea of covenant faithfulness. We're going to unpack that a little bit more as we keep going. Chapter 25 summarizes the end of Abraham's life. And I just want to clarify about a concubine. A concubine is not a mistress or a prostitute. There's no illicit relationship implied here at all. And then going farther along, we see the 12 tribes that are descended from Ishmael. And the sad commentary, they lived in hostility toward all of their brothers. This hostility comes about because Abraham did not wait for God to fulfill his promise of a son. Then we move on to the Isaac stories in chapter 26.
If we look at verse 12, we're going to see Isaac. He's living in a time of a famine, and the scripture says that he got 100-fold return on all that he planted. 100-fold return. The Bible doesn't say anyone got 100-fold return. Just right here, Yahweh truly blessed him. In verse 28, we're going to see Abimelech comes back to Isaac after kicking him out of the area, and he says, we saw clearly that the Lord was with you. You are blessed by the Lord. Truly, he has become a tree of life for the people around him. They even recognize Yahweh's blessing upon his life.
Yeah. Now, it's a little bit disturbing to me that Isaac's wealth is measured in flocks and herds, but also in people. So apparently, people are part of his possessions. And how do we handle that? We have to be clear, again, that the Bible discusses things without endorsing them. So something that's in the culture, the Bible doesn't necessarily comment on. But also, let's remember that we are in a fallen and broken world. Mm-hmm. And this brokenness is manifested here in a distortion of God's plan, that people would have dominion over the earth. And we see them taking dominion over other people to the extent that they own them. The Bible does not approve of that. On to chapter 27, there's a manipulation here with Rebekah regarding her favorite son, and they scheme together to trick Isaac into giving the blessing to Jacob instead of Esau, instead of just waiting for God to do what he had said to Rebekah when she was pregnant with the twins: the older will serve the younger. She's pushing to make sure that it happens instead of waiting for God. The other thing we see here is something that I've got to get my mind wrapped around, is the significance of words, the power of the blessing. Mm-hmm. But I also want to note Proverbs 10:22, the Lord's blessing brings wealth, and he adds no sorrow to it. Mm-hmm. So what we see here is sorrow added. Jacob has to run away because his brother is threatening to kill him. On to reading 11, which starts with chapter 28 of Genesis. Now Isaac, as Jacob is running away, Isaac tells him, go back to our relatives to find a wife. And on his way out of Canaan, Jacob stops at a place that has the name Luz, and he has a dream there. In the dream, Yahweh appears to him, and he renews the covenant with all the blessings he had given to Abraham and Isaac. And I like the personal promises he gives to Jacob. I'm with you. I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you. And Jacob's response to this dream is in verse 17. It says he feared. I believe Jacob's wisdom begins right here with the fear of the Lord, which Proverbs talk about. And verse 20, Jacob actually makes some vows to the Lord that he'll come back. He said, if you'll bless me, I'll come back here, and I'm going to call this place Bethel, the house of God. In chapter 30, when Jacob is interacting with his father-in-law, it's interesting because verse 27, Laban says, Jacob, I've learned through divination that I've been blessed because of you. And this practice of divination is an example of syncretism. Laban's talking about Yahweh, but he's also practicing pagan magic. Syncretism is the merging of different belief systems and the practices of different belief systems. And we need to be so careful in our day because Eastern mysticism has very much infiltrated our culture. We need to guard against it creeping into the church, and we need the scriptures to give us the discernment to do that. We've been talking a lot about meditation, and that's actually an area of concern. We need to make sure when we're meditating, we're not emptying our minds and allowing who knows what to come in, but we need to make sure our meditation is firmly rooted in the scriptures. So back to Jacob and Laban.
Yeah, what about Laban? Why did he have to lose out if God was so big?
He didn't have to lose out. He could have cooperated with Jacob and shared the blessing with Jacob, but at every turn he opposes Jacob. The amazing thing is, as we see in chapter 31, verse 7, over and over, the Lord helps Jacob out. And the way he helps him is in verses 10 through 12. Jacob gets a strategy from the Lord in a dream. Mm-hmm. And this strategy is not a principle of how to livestock. It's just the way that Yahweh chose to work here to bless Jacob, and I think to teach Jacob how to hear his voice. But in that same dream, you see verse 13, God says, Jacob, I have seen what you're doing, what Laban is doing to you. Oh, and by the way, I'm the God that you encountered at Bethel. So he tells Jacob, it's time to go back. So Jacob has a conversation with his wives, and I like that he does that. But in this conversation, we learn something about the bride price, which kind of bugs some people. The bride price is not at all about a man buying a woman to be his wife. The bride price is a practice that's designed to give some financial stability to a couple starting out, and it also provides something of an insurance policy to the woman in case her husband dies or divorces her. And we see Rachel and Leah are concerned because it's clear to them that Laban has not done with the wealth that Jacob accumulated for Laban and for them, and they haven't gotten anything from it. Now, it's interesting that Jacob now has 2 wives and 2 concubines. This practice of a man having multiple wives and concubines is completely culturally appropriate, and God works with it, but it does fall short of God's ideal that we see in Genesis 2. A man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his one wife. And although God works with this, this story clearly portrays how this falling short of God's plan here resulted in jealousy and scheming and conflict. And now we're getting into reading 12, which starts with Genesis 32. In verse 10, Jacob says to the Lord, I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Jacob's ego has been right-sized. He realizes that there's nothing that he has that didn't come from God. And also he recognizes the fulfillment of God's promise. And the word we see again, chesed, is kindness in my version, but it's not just God's kindness in view. Again, it's his unwavering commitment to keep his promises. And that's what gives Jacob confidence as he's going back and is about to meet his brother. He says to the Lord, I am afraid, but you have said. He reminds himself of God's promises, and that gives him confidence.
In verse 24, we're going to see Jacob actually wrestling with an angel. Okay, here's another angel. And it says that he wrestled with the angel till daybreak, and then the angel is saying, let me go, let me go. And Jacob is saying, no, I will not let you go until you bless me. Because he knew he was in trouble, and he wanted God on his side. He wanted Jehovah. He was afraid, like you just got finished saying. So the angel says, what is your name? He says, my name is Jacob. And Jacob is commonly known as like a deceiver, because that's what he's been doing, and that's what has happened to him. He says, no longer will you be called Jacob, but you shall be called Israel, which means he wrestles with God and he wrestles with man, and he prevails. Thus his name was changed.
Okay, moving on in chapter 34. Jacob, verse 18, says that they camped within sight of the city of Shechem. There's a problem there that we see quickly in chapter 34, and I think this, when it says they camped in sight of the city, we're supposed to remember Lot looking towards Sodom and Gomorrah and pitching his tent in that direction. In chapter 34, soon Dinah is hanging out with the daughters of the women Isaac didn't want Jacob to marry. And this is a sad story, and we see in verses 8 through 10, the people of the land are inviting Jacob and his family to integrate. Yeah. Hey, join with us, intermarry with us, trade with us. This is the very thing Abraham and Isaac were trying to avoid. And the incident starts with this young woman walking in step with the wicked. We have to be so careful that we don't ignore the warning of Psalm 1 that we looked at in our first reading. Chapter 35, God tells Jacob to go back to Bethel, And I'm not sure why he had to tell him that. That's what Jacob had promised God he would do.
Mm-hmm.
But he's going now. But first, verse 2, we see Jacob says, purify yourselves, get rid of the foreign gods. The time has come to get serious about worshiping Yahweh, and for them as a community and as individuals to dedicate themselves to the exclusive worship of Yahweh, not to mix in other gods, as we saw Laban do. So they bathe, they change their clothes, they take their idols and their earrings, they bury them under the oak. And even though we don't understand, we might not see the connection with what things we're supposed to get rid of, we can ask the Lord to show us, Lord, are there things in our lives that we need to bury, that we need to get rid of, to help us to move forward? Verse 5, once they go through this process, this cleansing process, the Lord's protection is on them. And there's a completeness to Jacob's journey once he gets back to Bethel, house of God, because he's returned to the place he started. So then we go on as we're wrapping up the story of Jacob now with the birth of Benjamin and unfortunately Rachel's death in childbirth.
Now we're at reading 13, starting in chapter 36. This is Esau's family, his descendants. In verse 6, we say that he moved away from his brother Isaac because their blessings were both so much that the land couldn't contain them. So they moved away. In time, Esau's descendants will become Israel's neighbors. Okay? In chapter 37, we get to the young man Joseph. Let me just say this. More is said about Joseph than even about the life of Abraham. Joseph is one of the most Christ-like examples that we have. I cry when I read this story. I think you will too. As Abraham's faith grew over the decades, we're going to watch Joseph's character grow as we read these scriptures. His faith was good. It was already there, but his character needed to grow. At the age of 17, he was the favorite son of his aged father. His father lavished on him a coat. Some call it the coat of many colors, but that coat designated him to receive a double inheritance as the firstborn. The problem was that Joseph was the 11th born, okay, making his brothers hate him. And then God gives him some dreams, 2 dreams. And instead of pondering them and praying about them, he tells everybody around his family with a bragging attitude. And it made his brothers hate him even more. And they were jealous of him. Let's take a look at Joseph's character in here. Starting in verse 6. If you look, Joseph says, I had a dream. And he says, my sheaths stood upright. And then he says in another verse, he says, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bow down to me. You notice the I, the me, and the my? You can get a highlighter every time he starts talking about that and write that down, because we're going to see that continue as we look at his character. Okay? His father sends him to check on his brothers and to report their actions. Joseph was a tattletale. The brothers hate him even more. So when they saw him coming, they planned to kill him, but they wind up throwing him in a pit. Then he gets sold to the Ishmaelites, and there's no more bratty little brother. He's on his way to Egypt.
Okay, in chapter 38, we have a weird story. I just want to make a note that this practice of a brother taking his brother's widow is not at all unique to the Bible. So we have, when Judah leaves his brothers, he marries a Canaanite woman. He has 2 sons. And Tamar, she marries one, then the next she's widowed twice. So what's the point of this story? There's a scandal here. But God still uses this family line for all of the kings of Judah. And also, this is the family line of Jesus.
Chapter 39. This chapter is such a contrast to the chapter that Esther just went over about the 2 brothers, Judah and Joseph. Okay? So let's look at Joseph here. Joseph, we see here, after he goes to Egypt, he becomes a slave in the house of Potiphar, one of the officials. And he'll become a tree of life in this household. Okay? Potiphar will entrust Joseph with everything that he has because Joseph is so faithful. God's favor was on Joseph during this time. Potiphar's household was blessed. Everything that Joseph touched was blessed. Everything was perfect in Potiphar's house until Potiphar's lustful wife tried to seduce him many times, but one particular time she got Joseph alone, okay? And instead of Joseph giving in to some fleeting moments of pleasure, he chose to run out of there and to live out his godly convictions. He ran from sin. He didn't compromise with it. He didn't negotiate with it. But let's do this. Let's do the character test. Let's notice what comes out of Joseph's mouth in the time of testing. Starting in verse 8, okay? This is what he was saying to Potiphar's wife. He says, your husband put all that he has under my authority. You see that? And listen to this one. No one in this house is greater than I am. Wow. Wow, that's a heavy statement. The Bible warns us that we are not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought. What was Joseph's reward for his faithfulness? Prison. Now it seems like this whole world, Joseph's whole world, is turning upside down again and again. Yet, somehow he remains faithful to God.
Frank, how does he do that?
That's a good question. I believe it's because he listened to his father's teaching. Because the faith was supposed to be passed down. And his father spent some time passing that faith down to his favorite son. Proverbs 4 says this, my son, pay attention to what I say. Turn your ear to my words. Do not let them out of your sight. Keep them in the midst of your heart, for they are life to those who find them. His father was faithful to pass the faith down, but Joseph was faithful to hang on to the teaching, even in the tough times. Okay, now reading 14. In chapter 40, Joseph will be interpreting dreams while he's in prison. More than likely, God has been using Joseph to interpret dreams since he's been in Egypt. No one is this comfortable like Joseph is and have such confidence with this if the gift is new. So my guess is God has been using him, even if it was in a menial way, as a slave, using the gift so it can get sharper. Here Joseph will interpret the prisoner's dream with such accuracy that it seems unforgettable. The only problem is the cupbearer does forget about Joseph. So let's check in on Joseph's character. In verse 14, Joseph will say to those under his care there, he'll say, remember that I was with you. And he'll also say, please mention me to Pharaoh. The issue is that Joseph, he's just a slave. He has no future. He's basically a nobody, and he's not getting out of prison. It doesn't look that way. And that all might be true, but God put a dream in him, and he wouldn't let it go. So I believe that it was these last 2 years that he spent in prison that were the worst times for Joseph, that he probably totally gave up on that God-given dream. Okay? It was 13 years prior that God had given it to him, and now I believe he was just abandoning all hope of it ever coming to pass. And the reason I believe that is because of what Jesus said. Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it cannot bear fruit. So Joseph dies to his dreams. Chapter 41, now Joseph is going to be before Pharaoh in this chapter. This chapter is absolutely amazing. And I think that this chapter could be renamed Joseph Passes God's Test. Because now he's put aside the self-centered teenager that he used to be. Okay? And after all the hardship that he experienced in all the time that he was in Egypt, in one day, he's going to go from the prison to the palace to ruler of all of Egypt. Plus, he's going to be marrying a beautiful woman. God's reward is on the faithful. But let's check in on his character. Let's look at his humility and wisdom that Joseph displayed while before Pharaoh. Starting in verse 15, Pharaoh is saying, I, Pharaoh, had a dream, and you can interpret it. He's talking to Joseph. And Joseph says, I am not able to. Do you see the humility that comes out? Joseph says, it is God who will interpret the dream. There's no Joseph. There's no Joseph. Listen to this one. It is God who will reveal to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Again, no Joseph. Okay? And then he lays out the plan for Pharaoh that God gave him. And he said, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man. Again, no Joseph. This was the chance for Joseph to say, I'm that man. I'm that man. I'm the one that's going to do this. But he doesn't, because there was no Joseph left. And as a result, Pharaoh recognizes that God's spirit was in this man, Joseph. Now, Joseph passes the test that God put before him. Now he is ready to be the ruler of Egypt and the father even to Pharaoh. Okay, a position that God had been grooming him for a long time.
Okay, chapter 42, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt. And in verse 6 it says that they bowed down to Joseph. And we might tend to read this as a score, Joseph 1, brother 0, but more importantly, it's the fulfillment of a prophetic dream, and it's evidence that God has been in control the whole time. We get into reading 15, chapter 44, and we'll tend to read this as though Joseph is playing mind games with his brothers just to torture them as revenge for what they did to him. But think of this. Joseph doesn't know if his brothers have changed or not. He doesn't even know if Benjamin is alive until he questions them some. But he's strategizing here not to get revenge, but to make sure that Benjamin is safe. So his number one priority is to protect Benjamin, and number two is he wants to test his brothers and see what's in them. And he has so much wisdom that he's able to make this a win-win situation. So first of all, if the brothers turn out to be jerks still, at least Benjamin is with him. And second, if the brothers have changed, he'll be able to see this. And he does see it because in what pans out, the brothers are willing to lay their life down for Benjamin. What's important is that Joseph has already forgiven them, and hopefully through these tests they can see that they've changed and maybe forgive themselves.
Let's take a look at verse 15. So Joseph will be talking about knowing through divination. I just want to address that. Let me assure you that Joseph did not practice divination. He was only using it as a statement to set the brothers up. Okay? Joseph's faith was pure. It was not polluted by the ways of the Egyptians and their gods. Okay? Now let's move on to chapter 45. In chapter 45, Joseph is 39 years old at this point. His brothers threw him in the pit at the age of 17. Now he's going to reveal himself to them. And imagine all the pain that he had endured through these years, bottled up inside for the last 22 years, is about to explode out of him in a flood of tears. Okay? I think it's applicable right now, Jesus' words when he was on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. If there was any trace of anger, resentment, or even bitterness, it would have showed up here. But it doesn't, because it didn't exist in this man Joseph. And why? Because Joseph had God's perspective. So listen, starting in verse 5, we can see a couple statements of Joseph. He said, God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. God sent me ahead of you to establish a remnant. And it was not you who sent me here, but rather God. Those are amazing statements of faith by this mighty man of faith. So Joseph's faith is really coming out in all of this. Let's go over to chapter 46. Jacob leaves for Egypt. But before leaving the land of Canaan, Jacob stops and offers sacrifices to the God of his father. So in this, God speaks to Jacob in a vision. And in this vision, God is just reassuring Jacob that he's doing the right thing. It doesn't look right. He's not in the promised land, but just to have faith that God knows what he's doing. So Jacob goes to Egypt with 70 people, and 400 years later, Moses will be leading between 1 and 2 million people out of the land of Egypt with a great deliverance. they had become a great nation. In chapter 47, just want to look at verse 27. It says, Israel settled in the region of Goshen. They became fruitful and multiplied. And there it is. They became fruitful and multiplied. That was God's plan all along. It was God's plan for Adam and Eve. It was God's plan when he started over with Noah. And it was God's plan for Abraham. And now his descendants are doing that. Okay? We have 2 more chapters in Genesis to do. But we want to just do the concluding marks right now. At creation, we saw chaos. The fall brought chaos. At the flood, there was chaos. The Tower of Babel, there was chaos. We see chaos in the life of these 4 patriarchs. And Joseph, as he trusted God, was able to rise above the chaos that was around him and also that was in him. And he became a tree of life, not only to his people, but to nations. If you want to be a tree of life for people around you, you need to listen to what the New Testament book of James has to say. It says this in James 1:27. It says, true religion before our God and Father is this, to care for the vulnerable, to look after the widows and the orphans in their distress, and to keep oneself unpolluted by this world.
Lord help us. Hey, thank you for being with us for this talk. Our next talk will cover reading 16 through 21. We'll be finishing up Genesis and then getting into the New Testament Gospel of John after we pull in just one psalm. I hope you'll join us. Bye.